afternoon, everyone. I'll just come up here for a quick introduction. Thank you for coming to this session, the final session of the day, Rethinking Freight and Logistics. I'm joined by a very eminent panel of speakers with me this afternoon. My name's Chris Hillcoat. I'm an Associate Director at KPMG in the Future Mobility team. I'll ask my panelists, please, just to introduce yourselves for a few seconds each, just to say who you are and where you're from. Perhaps I can start with Ashton.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashton Cole. I'm Senior Public Affairs Lead for the Road Haulage Association.
I'm Phil Smart. I'm the Regional Policy Manager with the Rail Freight Group. And if you think of us as the road haulage equivalent of stuff on rail, you won't be too far wrong.
Hi, I'm Liz Metheringham. I'm Head of Integrated Transport at Connected Places Catapult. And for those unfamiliar with what Connected Places Catapult is and what we do, we are one of 9 catapults that were set up by the government in order to help accelerate new innovation. And we're particularly focused on transport.
David Heitch, notionally Parkgate Consultants, but I have a portfolio of business providing advisory services and project management across a number of different transport operations and framed around technology, too often looking at the use of pencils rather than the use of biros as a good technology answer to the problem.
Marvellous, thank you very much. Well, we're here to discuss freight and logistics as an industry and as some specific topics, but just to get us going, I've just got some thoughts to open our time. Then we'll have a panel discussion for, I would guess, 30 or 40 minutes, and then we should have time for some questions at the end. So please do jump in towards the end with your comments and your questions. Everything you eat, everything you buy, everything you wear, everywhere you live, it all gets to you somehow in a truck or a train or a van or all three of those. And freight is an absolutely core element of the transport system. There is nothing that could exist or happen in this country without the freight industry. But most transport policy, we might say, doesn't give it its full attention or due regard. That's for all sorts of reasons, many of which are perfectly reasonable. But the focus on moving people around versus the focus on moving goods around, it does lead to different understandings of what's important, different priorities, different focuses, different pressures. In some places, we see that freight is regarded more as a problem than as a key solution. And so often one might read in the news about pressures to restrict HGVs during rush hour or restrict HGVs overnight, or even in both, which is an interesting conundrum of when we think freight vehicles should be allowed to drive on the road. Schemes like the London Lorry Control Scheme are a great example of a policy that's been put in place probably 40 years ago. It's evolved, or rather hasn't evolved, with the industry and poses a lot of operational challenges, but is a very fixed political landscape, which is difficult to change. So freight is critical. Freight is the strategic lifeblood of the economy. We might think of the number of vehicles that are trucking up and down the M1 or the M6, which is in excess of 20,000 each day. We might think of the rail freight that's using some of the main lines in the country, the West Coast and the Great Western and others. We might think of the short straits, the crossings between Kent and France, where over a third of the food that we eat is imported through the Channel Tunnel or the Port of Dover, and over £250 billion of trade is carried out through those two ports every year, and it's done through a system of about 10,000 trucks and drivers who are mostly just driving back and forth, sometimes several times a day. So that's an unusual but a really important part of the industry, and we see it replicated in other parts of the country. Lots of challenges as well that the freight industry faces, and we think about the interaction between road and rail. You may have seen in the news that Royal Mail has now stopped running trains Of course, it's been a fixed historical part of the landscape for over 100 years, the Mail Rail. Indeed, Royal Mail built a massive depot in West London at a perfect location to intercept the North Circular, the A40 and the West Coast Main Line, and it's now stopped running trains from there altogether. So lots of challenges that are being faced. And we also see, of course, in the freight industry that supply chains are part of larger flows. They don't exist in isolation. They're often international. They often involve a mixture of goods and services and components and finished parts. So there's a lot of complexity going on in freight that is not always apparent to the untrained eye. The other thing to say is that the freight industry is an extremely innovative industry. Sometimes we might look at it and think it's a little bit sort of dyed in the wool or a little bit staid, but in actual fact, the freight industry is innovating in all sorts of ways in terms of the efficiency of vehicles and assets and people, in terms of the security of goods and loads, in terms of decarbonisation and switching to zero emission or lower emission trucks. It's innovative in terms of the way that warehouses are designed for cross-docking and interchange between different vehicles coming in, coming out, and how loads are tracked and modelled and moved between trucks. It's innovative in terms of automation. This is more emerging rather than present, but there's a lot of discussion going on around what automation will look like in the freight industry, how it can be done safely, how it can be done efficiently, how it can be done to not just replace things that exist today, but actually to change entire industries. And it's innovative in terms of consolidation. So we look at the massive rise in home delivery, in parcel lockers for drop-offs and pickups, in terms of urban consolidation and switches to smaller vehicles for those last-mile trips. These are all things which are being thought through and tried out and innovated up and down the country. So now we're going to go into a panel discussion, and we're going to talk about some of the blockers, the challenges, the opportunities, and the innovations in this industry. So I shall relocate to the panel. And let me start then by asking my fellow panelists for some of the blockers and the challenges that you see when you look at the freight industry, how it operates, and how it would like to operate in the future. David, perhaps I could start with you, and we could sort of work our way back up the panel.
Thank you, Chris. My perspective on this is that we've lost sight of why we have a freight industry. It's about making sure that the supply chains that are essential for everything that happens, whether it's manufacturing, that'll be as a result of and then lead to exports, whether it's for manufacturing in this country, and by manufacturing I include agriculture as well, because believe it or not, we do produce food still. It doesn't all come through Dover. And at the moment, we don't look hard enough or comprehensively at the ports that are actually the gateway both in and out of this country for the bulk of exports and imports, and making sure that the infrastructure that links those ports with the centres of with the rest of the supply chain has sometimes not taken high enough priority. And if you look at the main ports in this country, the ports work really well. If you look at Port of Tyne, you look at Felixstowe, Southampton, pretty efficient, but they're all constrained by having distinct transport issues with the rest of the infrastructure, whether it be rail or road. And if you've somebody who uses the A34 a bit, you know when a container vessel has been processed, because the number of trucks going up and down on the A34, or indeed east and west on the M27, have become quite critical, and times you want to avoid those roads. So that those are the blockers. It's about our thinking and about how we reflect. Yes, we can spend a lot of time looking at the technologies, looking at rail freight and the way it's been ill-considered for the last 100 years, and just to move people around, and then they only complain anyway. So, containers tend not to complain too much, which is much happier for the rest of us. So I think it's, and roads, we're constantly focused and fretting about roads, not unreasonably. I can't wait for autonomous trucks to come along, so we don't have to worry about driver's hours and that sort of thing. They can just get on and do the job. But it's about the way ports, and we manage, we get a train to turn up at the port when the containers are there, or just after the containers are unloaded, not a week later. So we can actually make the ports much more efficient.
Thank you very much. Thanks, David. Liz, can I come to you for any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was going to add that really to pick up on what you said, it is about that whole collaboration. I think one of the things we really don't do well, although we are trying to make improvements on it, is collaborate cross-modally. We think very much in our own lane. I'm a port, what do I need to do to be really efficient and operate that port well? And similarly, when you're kind of transporting goods by road and rail as well. But we don't actually think, what is the full end-to-end journey? How can we improve it? If we did work closer together, what could we do? And then, obviously, from Catapult's perspective, we're keen to understand, well, what innovation can you bring into that? How can you introduce that innovation? How, and understanding the challenges as well. I think sometimes, we're much improved at understanding a challenge around a particular mode or area, but actually the challenge is just not within that area. It's the whole end-to-end piece. So I think for me, it's how can we collaborate more effectively together and think of those problems in the bigger kind of macro rather than the micro environment.
Thank you. Phil?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chris. I think picking up the point that you made at the start, the problem is that freight doesn't enjoy a high enough profile. Even today, you could say, oh, well, you can tell we're putting freight last and all the other things. But I think freight's bound to move up the agenda. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that every home is full of items, consumables, more durable items, that at some point have probably been conveyed around the planet in a shipping container, conveyed from a port to a distribution centre, where perhaps it then goes by lorry to more localised distribution. I think that's probably the direction of travel that rail and road will be working more as partners in the future. But in terms of the constraints, obviously the ports are where they are for a reason. The three major deep-sea ports of Felixstowe, London Gateway and Southampton aren't in the south because the industry's got it in for the north and hates Liverpool or Manchester. It's quite simply that the vessels now, to achieve the economies of scale, are so large that they carry what 24,000 TEU, which is 20-foot equivalent unit. I don't expect everyone to know what that is, except that if you were to unpack it and line up all the containers from end to end, it would stretch for 91 miles. And if you sent it all by road with a cab and a safe braking distance, that's a 500-mile lorry convoy. I'm just saying. So, but unfortunately, of course, you've got London in between those three southern ports and the rest of the country. And now one of the constraints is recognising that we need to focus our infrastructure, inland infrastructure, a bit more about how do we get more stuff on rail for the longer distance journeys from, say, Felixstowe to, say, Trafford Park here in Manchester. And the reverse is true with aggregates. Basically, the rail freight industry divides neatly into three groups. There's containers from ports, generally, although there's some other domestic stuff, aggregates and all else. And there's the aggregates, which has to come the other way, because all the certain types of stone has to come from the Mendips or from Derbyshire or West Midland or somewhere. And a lot of the demand for building work is in the south. So again, you're trunking a lot of material around the country in the opposite direction. And you can't use the same wagons for both. It just doesn't work that way. So I think perhaps I'll pause there and move on.
Thank you. No, really interesting. Ashton.
Thank you, Chris. I would generally I'd accord with everything the others on the panel have said, and add and really develop on that. Some of us in the industry, when we speak about the lack of policy or the lack of consideration of the freight industry and policy, we actually call it freight blindness. It's sometimes you do see almost an element of perhaps hostility or lack of understanding, but often it's just not referenced at all. We've done some studies in the RHA looking at transport and local development plans across the north and found only 20% really had almost any reference to freight at all in their transport plans. And actually the National Transport Plan, started under the previous Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, was not going to mention freight at all. It is now. Thankfully, a new Secretary of State and some effective lobbying by perhaps some of the people on the panel here, were able to get it included in the agenda. Because you're right, 82% of everything, of all logistics at some point travels by road, on road freight. A large proportion of the goods we move still go by road. It's right, yeah, we can do more to go by rail. I'll loft an airball to my colleagues in rail and say that part of the, a lot of the infrastructure that needs to be improved in order to do that. Ely North Junction is one that particularly speaks to my interest, given I'm formerly of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, and it's very much in that patch. It's just, there needs to be that better consideration across the piece of how it works, as you said, Liz, from end to end, and thinking about, just what do we need to make sure that we can achieve all the goals we want to when it comes to making sure that the country is still supplied.
I think there's a recognition within the industry about this partnership role. I mean, quite a number of Ashton's members are also members of the Rail Freight Group because they use rail for the longer distance services like Maritime, Malcolm's and Brussels and so on. Yeah. So there's quite a few of them.
I'd say logistics it's an ecosystem. And a narrative of competition between rail and road is not helpful, and I don't think it's accurate. I would always, so I say it's the right mode for the right load. What makes it the right mode? I'd say really there's sort of, feel free to add to this, but I'd say that the three major considerations are customer demand, efficiency, and also the regulations and infrastructure in which they're operating. That's a system that's controlled by people, and that's making sure if you want to change how it operates, those are the three levers you need to pull.
Thank you. So we've covered a number of blockers, barriers, challenges. We've talked about geology. We've talked about shipping. We've talked about the Town and Country Planning Act, 1947. And I'll leave it up to you to decide which of those is the most intractable of the three. But I don't want to give us a sort of counsel of despair. I think we'd like to think about some of the good things that are happening or could happen. So let's move the discussion on to thinking about what are some of the ways in which freight and logistics companies and bodies and industry are already innovating. So what are some of the good examples that we can think of things that are happening now or have happened in the last few years where we think, oh, well, actually, that's positive, perhaps it's unexpected, perhaps it's new, and perhaps it's really exciting. Liz, can I come to you first on this one?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be slightly biased here, and I'm going to sort of mention the Freight Innovation Fund, which is one of the programs that we run at the Catapult. And I think what's interesting about that, it's an accelerator program that's sponsored by the Department for Transport. It had initially quite a heavy focus on decarbonisation, but it's expanded beyond that now. So we're looking at everything to do with freight. It is not modal specific, which I think is really good. And the kind of innovators that we're getting out of that are very varied. So we have a lot that are kind of looking at AI. So they're looking at, solutions for sort of backloads on vehicle deliveries, but also kind of optimization. It's that question of just because that's the way you've always done it, is that the way you should do it, and what other solutions come up, to more sort of practical things like lighter weight trailers. There's things around kind of safety, for people that are operating in ports and in logistics and warehouses. So it's kind of joining all those elements together. And I think that the important thing and what makes the program really successful is that it connects all the stakeholders. So it connects the innovators, it connects academia, it connects industry that will set the challenges, what are the problems that they're trying to solve. But now the next stage for us is connecting the investment, actually making people want to invest in freight. I think there's a lot to be said for innovation and where it's going and the enthusiasm and the money that it's driving.
Brilliant, thank you. David, do you want to chime in on any of these?
Yes, a couple of things. One, I reinforce what Liz says about Catapult and work they're doing, particularly in the port of Tyne, and I think that's sort of gradually getting some momentum. The other port where there is some fairly significant innovation is Felixstowe, and they're deploying autonomous vehicles to take containers, units from through the port and out to a distribution centre. The systems and the processes are imported straight from China, but I think it makes a useful example of where we can do some reverse copying of what they do rather than them copying what we do, and learning about how to make that work in other ports, and also being able to scale it. Because I think we should, yes, the deep water ports are important, but it's also the next tier of ports, the Aberdeens, Immingham, Bristol, even down to ports like New Haven and Plymouth, which are important as well in terms of developing innovative approaches, where they can serve a hinterland without having to create huge changes in the existing network, although I would say they need to think hard about all those rail lines that were chopped in 1964 or whatever. Get over it. So that, I think, is a big change, and I think there is innovation. The challenge is actually making that, getting the, if you like, the freight operators, the trucking and the rail companies to work together with the ports. And it comes to simple things like scheduling. So understanding that you don't have wagons sitting idly or lorries turning up and the cargo isn't ready. We have the means to do this scheduling. For God's sake, we know what's on the vessel. We know how quickly it takes to get a vessel into somewhere and unload it. And so it's about using some of these technologies as a flow through to meet the requirement. And if you add on to that the manufacturing sort of imperatives of just in time and those things, then why doesn't that go back down the supply chain and yet utilize that facility as well? So that's where I think we're not. We can be more innovative using technologies we already pretty well understand to improve the value of what we're doing.
If I can add to that as well, I think you're right there, David. We have members. We've got a member based right next to the port, so know well what's going on in Felixstowe. And talking on that efficiency, on again using technologies to make sure you reduce that idling, to make sure that they reduce empty running, really important. You're seeing more and more businesses making use of haulage exchanges now and similar and other programs where you put somebody has a load to move, say, I've got this here, who's available, who's got a truck nearby, and how much can you move it for? And a lot of businesses are now surviving almost entirely off using these exchanges to be able to say, yeah, I can do that here. And I've seen it's quite one of our smaller members down in Berkshire it's quite it's all in quite one small hut, but it's quite an operation. You look at all the screens they have telling them exactly where their truck is, where the loads are. There is a lot that they can be going there. I'll also speak to the work that Catapult are doing in the West Midlands as well. The innovator cluster they've got down there in the West Midlands we've been involved with since the start. And it's really starting to come up with some really interesting things, and is leading on improving that policy making point that I was talking about earlier. We all know how important the West Midlands is to moving stuff all around the country. And it's great we've got a combined authority there that's brought in people like the Catapult, is bringing the industry together there to really take the area forward.
Because it's really thinking about the bigger picture, isn't it? They want to grow the industry locally as well. So they're really encouraging that. So I think kind of more authorities that kind of look at that perspective, that say, actually, it's not just about freight and logistics, it's also about our manufacturing business and what we can do and how we can develop and how we can create a thriving economy.
Yeah.
I think from the rail side, there's quite a bit of work going into, if you like, demystifying or demythologizing rail. Oh, it's difficult to use. Oh, I've got to have a whole trainload before they'll talk to me. There's quite a bit of work going in among some of our member companies looking at selling spare space on freight trains to load them more efficiently. And that's in everyone's interest, whether it's the big consignee or the small one. And there's the other thing that, as I think David mentioned, you can track what's happened to a shipping container halfway around the planet. You stick it on a train, and then it goes into radio silence until it pops out the other end. And consumers are very impatient people. They want to know exactly where their product is at any one time. And then, of course, they also have the inalienable right to send it back when it's the wrong colour or size. But that's another debate. So there is some innovation going on in there. And I think the other piece of innovation that is not talked about much is the development of something called the iWagon. If you get on a passenger train, you become aware of all the computers it's got on board, talking up and down the train. There's announcements made, there's digital displays, there's the stuff that operates the doors and the heating and ventilation. Doesn't happen on a freight train. And yet, out of disaster comes some really interesting innovation. So some years ago, there was a locked wheel on a wagon that wore a groove in they call it a false flange. And when it got to the next junction, over went the wagon. There was a huge chemical spill, fires, you name it, disaster. And then somebody twigged, well, hang on a minute, if only we had some intelligent kit on the wagon to inform the driver when this was stopping. And that's now coming to commercial development. The challenge, of course, is then who pays for that? Because freight exists in the private sector, whether it's road or rail. And the benefit of having that actually falls to the network operator, so they don't have the line out of action for so long. And so how is the payback on that investment? Is it through reduced insurance premiums? Is it through reduced track access charges? And this is a developing area of conversation with regulators and infrastructure providers.
It's a big point, that question of who pays, because the end point, the customer is always the one that pays. Cost in the supply chain end up increasing the cost of everything on the shelf at the end of it. And particularly we're seeing this in the move to zero-emission vehicles. They are significantly more expensive to buy than fossil fuel vehicles. And at the moment, when they are a viable option for a business, a company, a customer has, the extra cost does get passed on to the customer. Eddie Stobart a few years ago bought a fleet of liquid natural gas vehicles that when the economy slowed down, customers weren't willing to pay to use, so they sat idle. We have a member, Nichols, down in Sittingbourne, who has they got a contract with a Scandinavian paper company, and said, we can use liquid natural gas for your deliveries and use their LNG fleet for all those deliveries, which is great. But that was driven by Nichols. It wasn't asked for by the customer. Nichols, when I met them, they said, we've never had a customer come to us and ask us, what can you do to make this greener, to reduce the CO2 emissions that come from this? A customer's number one concern at the moment is still, how cheaply can you do it?
although that is changing, and more and more there are end consignees who are asking the question about the various scopes of their carbon operation. Well, we've reduced our carbon, but what about suppliers? How does stuff get to site? And so shareholders are taking an increasing interest in this. I think one of the interesting manifestations is how the sector is investing. It is investing in the strategic rail freight interchanges that carry this absolute point about the right load and the right mode. So the long distance stuff from a port, it'll go by rail. And some of the developers who are, I mean, there's these places going up all the time. There's West Midlands Interchange in planning, Parkside in planning. We've just opened Northampton Gateway, Radlett's under construction, and so on. There's a load of these springing up all the time based on this idea of a proper linked up supply chain that recognises the various modes. And I think one of the other advantages, and we haven't talked about this, is around some of the demographics. If you've got a distribution model that takes freight over a long distance by rail to somewhere where the lorries can charge overnight, they can do a more localised distribution out and back within a battery range, within a shift, charge the vehicle overnight, and the driver goes home. Suddenly, you've got an industry that might appeal to people with family responsibilities.
Yep.
Which usually gets a tick from the women in the room. Why ignore half the workforce from a recruitment point of view?
Be very careful, because there are an awful lot of lady drivers of freight.
There's
Not enough.
There's not enough.
Only 2%. Only 2% of the industry are women at the moment.
Yeah.
We don't want any triggering going on right now.
No, but I'm trying to make a more general point. I can point to individual freight train drivers as well who are female. But as a general problem, there are structural problems in the haulage industry which can be addressed in part at least by making it a more lifestyle-friendly operation.
It's a generational issue, isn't it, for a lot of
yes, so
lorry
you've got a lot of
drivers who
people
are-
retiring, as have rail freight drivers, and there's an effort to recruit younger people into driving freight trains. That is a societal problem that needs addressing.
Yeah.
The other factor, I think, the other innovation is around the business models that ports in particular, where Associated British Ports have gone into partnership with a major car importer who's actually based up in Grimsby, but they've taken on a 35-year contract with the military at the military port at Netley, which has got a function as the main logistics distribution hub for military shipping. But it also has an awful lot of space, which is ideal for parking import cars and export cars without intruding on the local population. So it's about thinking differently, and then they can go on to transporters, whether they're rail or road. But it's about you thinking differently about business models, about the use of the land use and the place, and making that work better because you think about the whole problem.
I'll make one final point, if I may, again, on the net zero and on the customer point. Another example that I looked at just before I came up here, so thankfully it's fresh in my mind. ITAL, a company based not too far from here, an international logistics member of the Road Haulage Association, they now have a tool that does allow customers to see what their CO2 emissions are for their proposed jobs. Giving that information to customers again is a great way to also help shift their mindset. You know, when they actually see it in front of them, oh yeah, this is something actually that we could. So I hope that's something they're doing well and can be rolled out. But again, completely agree, David, that you've got to consider the effective use of space and getting that infrastructure in place. I mean, we're now on to one of my areas. I could go on for a very long time, so I'll try and keep it short, on providing rest facilities for drivers. I know, David, you're looking forward to the time there aren't any drivers, but we've still got to look after the drivers we have currently. And there are just not enough truck parking places, because local authorities don't generally approve them. We found that as one of the major
And they
blockers.
need to be safe as well,
They
for the
do.
cargo as well as for the drivers.
100%.
Whatever
Quite a
gender.
massive issue. And actually, a new truck park near Felixstowe was just refused because I haven't been able to go through to the details in full yet. So please don't quote me on this, but it was recorded in the local press that they potentially heard a nightingale, and it was on that basis that the site was refused. Not to say that environmental considerations aren't important; they are, but you've got to look at it in the balance. And rest facilities for drivers is an essential part of an infrastructure as a railhead, as a port. You know, it is part of the essential sidings that allow the system to flow efficiently and quickly. Again, customers, we all want everything tomorrow, don't we? I might ask the people we have in the audience their hands up if you've got an Amazon Prime membership. Yep, there we go. A lot of times what people want, a lot of when people talk about change they want to bring into the logistics industry, the unwanted side effect of that is going to be that things will move more slowly, and customers don't want that. So one of the main thing is to keep giving the customer what they want, which is stuff as quickly as possible.
So perhaps one of the hopes we might have, and we mentioned this earlier, is emerging planning guidance around having to take freight and logistics more into account in land use planning terms. And that isn't just about warehousing, but it might extend to things like welfare facilities. And I think, perhaps going back to the point I nearly got my fingers burnt on a minute ago, having a welfare facility is not, would I use it? It's, would my sister, daughter, aunt use it as well? It's got to be that good.
Yeah.
And we are sitting in the city that actually demonstrated what innovation means in terms of bringing your supply chain into your manufacturing base. So Manchester, when faced with punitive charges from Liverpool, not for the first or the last time, built their own canal. And dare I say, it wasn't an inky-dinky canal, it was a major canal for ocean-going vessels at the time and brought them straight into Salford, and thereby supported the cotton and the weaving industry directly, much to the chagrin of Liverpool, which they still moan about. But anyway, it was innovation on a very, very big scale. Now, they were able to fund it by raising shares and do the mechanisms in the commercial marketplace. There was no government money. So it was a real, it may be 150 years old, but actually it's an example of how you make something happen if you think, if you're committed and think about it enough.
I think it makes an excellent point, actually, that innovation has to be, it's fit for the use you put it to. So innovation 200 years ago was the invention of the railway, and we're sitting in an old station, aren't we? That,
Yes.
There's Manchester, one of the hearts of the original rail network, the growth of shipping, and then into the 20th century, the innovations in road freight, the invention of larger and larger trucks, the building of the motorway network, and then the shift back to rail freight. And now we think about innovation in terms of decarbonisation and shifting to zero emissions. We're doing a piece of work at the moment for one of a sort of FTSE 100 very large retailer distributor, and helping them to look at what does it mean for them to, picking up a point a minute ago, look at the emissions of their supply chain, and how does it look to trial an electric HGV? Is it suitable for everything? Is it suitable for some things? What are the issues around costs? What are the issues around charging, vehicle technology, getting people trained up to maintain and equip the vehicle, training your drivers so that they know how to operate this thing, which is different from the things they've used before, and does it work in all kinds of geographies? So lots of questions around innovation that you'd have to sort of dig into the detail to make it work, but that can have a really lasting effect. And as you say, there's in some cases there's a very physical legacy of innovation, and in other cases we might think more about the legacy of skills, of people, or of ways of working. We've had some great points here. I'd like to move the discussion on a little bit again in terms of opportunities for going further, and what we might need to change in order for those opportunities to come true. Let's start with land use planning, because it's a massive issue. We've talked about it already. We've seen it. We see it all the time when we look at a very local level, and for an individual local authority or even a sort of parish council, they might look at an application for a strategic freight interchange, a rest area, a warehouse, and think, well, I don't want this in my area. It's not right for my area, which may be true, may not be true, but it may be true. But then there's this question of the national interest, the regional interest, the local interest. How do we balance those up? Shall we talk a bit about that first, and how we might get through it? I think we've probably all got examples of where we see it going wrong, but can we think about what are some really good sort of opportunities for taking this combination of innovation and opportunities for change? Liz, can I come back to you?
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking from kind of going back to the ports, and we talked about that before. There's going to be change coming in ports. We've got new, vessels that will have new fuel types that need to be considered. And so, how we currently fuel the vessels is not going to be suitable. We'll need to have something new. But there'll be that period of change as well. And how do you manage that? And I think this is where we need to get a little bit smarter around planning. We need to not just say, actually, we'll just wait until it absolutely comes to that point where we have no choice and then that's what we'll do. It's actually think, how can we transition that? Do we need to be thinking now about offshore bunkering for fuel? Do we need to be thinking now about those fallow areas that are often around ports that could have other uses that, could support that kind of link with HGVs or rail or other things, and actually be a bit more proactive around planning? I think often we kind of, because it's a thorny problem, we leave it a little bit late in the day, and how can we be more proactive? And as part of that, I think you need to get people on board. You need to make them or help them understand what the benefit is going to be. They need to realise they're not going to get their Amazon Prime really quickly if we can't solve some of these thornier issues and really think about that. So
I think we are now starting. I think in the last few months, I am actually. We're starting to see some good thinking, better thinking of the needs of the logistics industry, better inclusion. Like I say, that the national transport plan, but also particularly actually here I can speak to Greater Manchester is currently consulting on its transport plan. And that has a huge section to talk about freight. They had a specific section bringing in all the different kinds of operators, both marine, maritime transport. Thinking about we still have the canal? What can we still use it? What are the opportunities there? Particularly bringing parcels right into you can bring them right into the centre of the city, and the West Midlands as well. A really good, really good transport plan they're developing out there. And finally, after, since I've been in the RHA now for 4 years, and I've been going on about national planning policy framework for the needs of the logistics industry for almost all that entire time, and a change was announced on the last day we were working just before Christmas, which they are currently consulting on, which changes the references to the freight industry from sort of one paragraph to at least 7, which is, it may sound small, but it's going to make no end of difference, really. If we so we're in the middle of the process of finishing that, our response to that consultation now. But again, increases that thinking of all aspects of the logistics industry and how it connects with all the other elements. Because this thing, it's an enabler. I say the logistics industry, we are the deliverers of economic growth. You want to grow the economy, it's going to be the logistics industry that actually delivers it. You want to build houses. So you mentioned aggregates earlier, Phil. It was you both need to be able to get the materials there to build the houses, and then those houses then become delivery points that you need to be able to get stuff to. It's starting to get better. Absolutely, we're starting to see that better innovation, that better understanding of the elements of logistics the part they play, what they need, and also how they contribute to everything else that we're looking to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a government that says it's really interested in house building. And my very well-worn phrase is that every new home is a unit of production during its construction and a unit of consumption during its occupation, hopefully requiring sustainable movement of materials. And yes, I would support what Ashton's just said about the land use planning and the changing nature of hopefully national planning policy through the planning policy framework. And I was involved on behalf of RFG in supplying some of the stuff under the call for evidence. And there's some best practice out there. I happen to be on a local authority, and there was an example of best practice. But unfortunately, you can't rely on having the right officer at the right local council with that mentality because of what I think you referred to before as freight blindness. I think that's changing. I think some of the other things that might also help is that in those areas of the country where there's currently two-tier governments, where planning was a district council function and transport was a county council function, and quite often the two authorities might not have seen eye to eye politically, and it might have become a bit of a political football. Well, hopefully what we've now got is, under a more unitary system of government, perhaps you might have situations where the planner is sitting in the same room, the transport planner and the land use planners in the same room, and actually sharing some thoughts about various sites and what is good overall. My only reservation in that is that we might be creating another two-tier system in that the mayoral combined authorities then sit above those unitaries. However, let's not forget what a mayoral combined authority is. It isn't just the elected mayor. It's not just your Andy Burnhams or your Steve Rotherhams. They have to sit in a room with the leaders of all of the unitaries in their patch. That is what the combined authority means. And therefore, you've got that opportunity for that exchange of ideas around strategies and what's happening in your area that contributes to this broader strategy. So I think, yes, there's some hope yet.
So, yes, things are happening and they change, but sadly, we don't learn quick enough. Some years ago when TFGM was looking at commuter routes, if you didn't live within 10 minutes, i.e. factory walking time, you weren't really a commuter, you were a long-distance traveller. So anybody living in to the far side of Greater Manchester in either north, south, east or west was then ill-considered. But we shifted that thinking to think about travel to work area as being more important than, frankly, the medieval boundaries that have been with us since 1350. And I think the same is true about the way planning and particularly infrastructure planning around freight and where we locate work, because those are the places where things have to go to or come from. So I think that's beginning to change. The challenge is, I live at a point where I can see 3 counties. So I can look out to the west and see Somerset, to the south I see Dorset, and if I just look around me I see Wiltshire. Now we're a mere 40 miles from the county town, but you'd imagine we were in Pitcairn Island as far as the consideration given. So it's you get some really weird decisions, and there is this difference between urban planning, which most transport and town planners are sort of happy with, and rural planning, which is a whole different skill set and understanding. And it's also about cross-agency planning. So it's about, we have 303 runs past, not me personally, but where I live, the village has the 303 running on a very nice dual carriageway. Unfortunately, somebody forgot to look at the drainage locally, and it floods periodically, which creates a bit of a hold-up. So it's about different authorities and different agencies working around schemes, around planning objects. So if you want to build a big estate, if you want to put some more employment in an area, so why are they building a Bridgewater battery factory with very little infrastructure from rail or road to actually service it, apart from the M5, which, as we know, is a wonderful thoroughfare and very quiet and never gets crowded at all, ever. So it's about, unfortunately, about this mindset. I agree that there are some planners who are very enlightened and aren't just obsessed by bats and nightingales. And you can have a dialogue with them and they'll listen. But too often, it's too much of a rush and there isn't enough thought beforehand given to the way that we need to make this work better.
I'd like to offer perhaps an antidote to that, which is a really good example of where local authorities came together to do something that was really good. And this was back in the mid-1990s, when an authority in East Anglia shook hands with one in the South Midlands, which was Ipswich and Milton Keynes. And they were interested in re-establishing the East-West Rail link. The consortium of local authorities that have been holding the flame on that project seemingly forever has now got representation from just about every authority from Avonmouth to Yarmouth. So here is local government that came together to create something that was going to be of mutual benefit. And we've heard earlier with Naomi Green introducing the task force for that Cambridge-Oxford arc. And I think that is an optimistic note perhaps to take forward, is that we are trying now to make better use of it, both for freight as well as passenger, looking at extending it further east and further west. So it's sort of, Bristol to Norwich, Oxford to Ipswich, really making it function for the benefit of the Port of Felixstowe, Haven and Thames Gateway and so on. So there's I think, hope yet. And that will carry on regardless of what the changes are in the local government structures that support it.
And again, there are good examples of how this can work. Greater Manchester Combined Authority came about because the 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester, gave up a lot of their own personal priorities in order for the greater good. And they knew that over a period of time, 5 or 10 years, they would all benefit. And from that, and it is this being prepared to give something up in order to get a return in the longer term. And if you don't think about the longer term, freight is a classic piece where, because it is big, expensive infrastructure at either end, as well as the bits that join up, you have to make that consideration. Otherwise, it won't ever happen. You'll just do a 2, 3, 5 year cycle, and away it goes in the wind. So I'm absolutely, endorse. Well, not entirely the Cambridge arc, but if you can remove half of Bristol, that's really good. Because it'll take an awful lot of the rugby competition away as well. However, sorry, we're drifting off topic, aren't we?
Brilliant, thank you.
Drift.
I'm conscious that we're nearly at the end. Can I come to the audience for any questions that you may have based on what you've heard around these topics of freight and logistics, about corridors, about interchanges, about intermodal travel? I believe there should be a roving mic coming to you. Yeah, thank you. I can see a couple of hands up.
This might be one for Phil. How do we get the government to take rail freight seriously? And you probably realise I'm talking about things like Ely, which have really good BCRs, really good business cases, but because it's focused on freight and logistics, and we've got a government focused on people, rightly, and growth, that they don't seem to have put those two together. What do you think is the miracle solution that we can get?
Right, so there's several things that I'd carry forward out of that. You're absolutely right. But we are very nearly there. What I think is needed, that up until now we've been talking to the Department for Transport, and we need to get other ministries on board, business and trade, housing, other ministries that have an interest in making that infrastructure work. There is also the Cambridge Growth Board, and we might be looking at things like, can we get some land value capture out of the big expansion of Cambridge to contribute towards this? Because you don't actually have to contribute huge amounts to get government to say, oh, well, now we're working in partnership with somebody, and it ticks a box. So there are a few other strings that we can pull. I sit on the Ely Task Force, and I know people from England's Economic Heartland do, and Transport East and so on, as well as the ports, or anyone who's got a shared interest in that bit of kit. But that's got to be as well as a multimodal argument, it's got to be a multi-departmental targeting.
Yeah. I think
Doesn't it also come back to piggybacking on government policy? So when the government says we want growth, the growth comes about because businesses are more productive, and they're more productive because they've got a more effective freight. And it's part of a whole continuum of argument, whether whoever's ear you're whispering in, we need better education across those departments, Treasury also,
Yes.
because that's how we make a change.
So the Treasury might be more interested in finding resources if it isn't just the Transport Ministry that's talking to them. So if it's housing, if it's environment, and so on, and that
But it's also about the return they get from, taxation, rateable values, whatever it might be.
Oh,
Yeah.
quite, yes. Absolutely.
And those are the arguments they'll believe, as well
Thank
as
you.
the,
Yeah, I think
the other ones.
cutting across those different departments is critical, isn't it, and silos. Any more questions? I can see another hand up. Or a couple more.
Decarbonisation. We're only now 4 years away from when you won't be able to buy a pure diesel or petrol van, and we're only 14 years away when you won't be able to buy a diesel HGV. Speak to any operator and they'll tell you that yes, we'd love to trial a battery HGV, want to give them a go, see what they're like, but they'll also tell you that when they've phoned their distribution network operator up and asked for a connection, they're told it's 10 years away and it'll cost X thousands, millions of pounds. So how do we get the planning and delivery right so we can actually get charging infrastructure into depots and also at the right locations on the strategic road network so that we can actually start to see some battery electric HGVs on the roads?
That's a great question. Thank you. Liz, do you have anything to contribute on this?
Oh, well, I was actually going to mention, I think National Highways and Innovate have just launched a call on this particular topic, focusing on actually where do we need on that strategic road network that charging infrastructure to be, but also bearing in mind your point of actually not that the kind of connectivity is not necessarily there at this point. What innovation is there that can give you a sort of stepping stone to where you need to be, knowing that might not be on stream for 10 years, but how can you still support that in the short term? So I think there are programs that are kind of looking at those types of things, but I think this goes back to what I said before about collaboration and having those discussions and really considering where those I guess those hotspots are, where we know that there is a problem and what can we do about it and how can we raise the profile of those particular areas.
Infrastructure, it's the biggest thing that's stopping it. When you don't have a guarantee that you'll be able to get your vehicle refueled, is one of the biggest blockers from an RHA member's perspective. I think part of this actually, devolution of power more locally does provide an opportunity there. You can see the work they're doing at Tees Valley. They want to be a hydrogen hub there. I know there was talk of Liverpool, so wanted to get into the hydrogen game as well. If you could sort of set up little local economies where they do have the certainty around a particular new fuel sort. Let the businesses there start to get used to it, start to use it. Let the technology improve, and then you start connecting those up. But it does need, you're right, innovative thinking and commitment over a long term from governments at all levels.
Thank you.
And I think it's a real point. I mean, it's not something, we'll wait for government. Actually, National Grid need to double their size, and they need to get the investment actually spent that they've got. in the ground or wherever it is they're going to put these wretched cables from the source of the power, the energy. But I think there's also an opportunity for businesses to look at how they can meet some of the gap, as Liz says, using renewables locally, whether that's solar, whether that's actually using battery storage as well. I just helped a small business, which is actually a sawmill in Somerset, rural Somerset. They've upgraded the sawmill. They wanted to put in some EV chargers. They started out with a 250 kVA substation from National Grid. When National Grid came along, they actually put in an 800 kVA, so we can have more sawmill and more chargers. So it's about what they actually have available sometimes, and not what they think they've got available. So it's
Thank you. And I think,
I'm sorry,
sorry to Phil, I believe we're actually out of time.
All right,
And
okay.
I'm conscious that we're the last session of the day. Thank you very much to my panelists for joining me and having this discussion. We could go on for a while, and there's obviously a lot to discuss in this topic. Thank you also to those of you who've come along to join us. Yes, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. So thank you very much.